Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to do this and very happy to be here. This is a topic that, although it's not directly connected with my research in philosophy, has been a recurring theme in the work that my institute does with students at Yale. As the introduction made clear, I am from England and was originally a student there, but I've been living in America for approximately 20 years now. And consequently, most of my experience of talking about this topic has been in the American contexts, sometimes with students, sometimes not. My expectation is that quite a lot of what I'm going to say will nonetheless sort of apply equally well to your own experiences. But I do hope to get to the question and answers period fairly quickly, because it'll give me a chance, I think, to discern if there are any sort of particular topics you would like to dig into, or any places where you feel my description doesn't quite match your experience. I do have a few slides which I hope will be helpful, so I'm going to try and share those with you. Let me see. Okay, so I hope that's working. Well, I'll start with the question of why are we talking about an attention economy at all? There was an argument that was made not so long ago that from an economic point of view, one of the defining features of the modern age was the shift from industrial manufacture to what was sometimes referred to as an information economy, with new technologies of communication, with computing and data work becoming more central to economic life. Maybe that was the way to characterize it. But the economist Herbert Simon, sorry, I'm just trying to make it change, had a quite nice observation, which is why I wanted to start. Simon said, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. And if we understand economics to be concerned with the allocation of scarce resources, then it makes sense to focus not what is abundant, perhaps even overabundant, which is information, but on the scarce resource we have to find out and choose how to allocate, which is our attention. So there are, that's always been a question we have to address, but it has taken on a different nature, become more acute in an age where we're bombarded by information. My experience has been when I talk to people about this topic, I don't need to persuade them there's a problem here. I think many people, while they may welcome elements of new technologies, new developments, are only too aware that there are difficulties that come with it. One contemporary manifestation is in my daily life, I meet lots of people who will sort of joke, but it's not really a joke about being addicted to their phones. They can't put them down. They're always checking them. And a lot of people are experiencing regret with how they spend their time, spend their attention. So they recognize there are difficulties here. In order to get at what's going on and to explore one of the underlying mechanisms, I wanted to talk about something which doesn't immediately look like it's about the attention economy at all, or about the information age, which is the psychology of gambling. Now, my understanding is in Turkey, gambling rules are quite restrictive. In America, they vary very much region by region. America is a federal system, and although some laws apply to the entirety of the United States, many rules are being made at the level of the states, or even sometimes more local governance than that. And gambling is one example where the rules have been very different depending on which part of the country you were living in. One city that had notoriously very loose gambling laws was the city of Las Vegas. And that led it to become a sort of tourist destination where, while there are other things to do, casinos and gambling became the primary occupation. And there's a researcher, an anthropologist called Natasha Dow-Schull, who did research work on how gambling machines have changed over time. And at the time she wrote this book, she didn't think what she was writing had any connection to the manufacture of computer applications or social media platforms or things like this. But after she published the book, people started approaching her to point out some uncanny similarities and some unnerving similarities between ways in which technologies had been adapted and developed to be more compulsive, more addictive, we might say, and principles of design that they were encountering in other parts of our life. So I'll start with the gambling machines, but the ultimate goal here is to shed light on phones, applications, and games and things of that nature. So if you were to go into a casino in Las Vegas, there are a few things that might strike you as strange. Besides the whole thing being a quite overwhelming experience, lots of noise and color and things like this. The first is there are no clocks. If you walk into one of these buildings, there is no indication of what time of day it is at all. You'd have to check your own watch. Nothing about the environment you're in gives you any information about that. There's a kind of timelessness that's built into the very way the environment's designed. Perhaps less obviously, but nonetheless significantly, there are no right angles in the design. You don't walk to the end of a corridor and find yourself with a choice to turn left or right. It's all gradual curves. Essentially, it's supposed to be a space you would navigate without ever having a reason to stop before you arrive at a gambling table or a machine. There's a kind of frictionlessness to the experience. And although this won't be obvious just to the tourists, for anyone running these businesses, the area of the casino that generates the most profit is the gambling machines. And so there is intense economic pressure to make these as profitable as possible. One other feature which is going to be relevant as we draw an analogy with other kinds of experience, games and apps and things like this, is that the amount of money a casino makes is in direct proportion to the amount of time somebody spends gambling. And that means if you're looking to extract more money from the experience, the thing to do is to say, how can we make this experience such that people will spend more time on this machine? And you're already beginning to see, the relevance to other kinds of cases. And if you would have gone to one of these places 50 years ago, the machines would have been these big steel rectangles with a handle you pull and you would put a coin in, and then there would be wheels that would turn, and if the symbols are all the same in a line, you would win some money. But they've changed quite dramatically. There's no longer a big lever you have to pull. There's a button that you press. These days, people usually don't even put coins in them. They'll charge a card and then swipe the card and just sort of add a balance. The grids that are before them are much more complicated, and there are many different ways in which you can win and lose. And significantly, sometimes you can win, but you win less money than you put in to play in the first place. Interestingly, the psychology of that still feels like a win to your brain, even though you've lost money. And that is a feature that they have learned to adapt and take advantage of to an extreme degree. Because there's no lever you have to push, there's just a button, you can gamble much faster. People talk about each particular bet as a hand, and you can just tap that button, and people can now play over 1,000 hands per hour. One way of describing this experience is it's as frictionless as possible. There's no natural stopping point. You can almost imagine yourself getting to a rhythm where it's just tap, 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 and on and on and on. And if you were to stand by somebody who's absorbed by this machine in front of them, tapping on this button, you'll often see very little affect. Whether they win or lose, you'll rarely notice it on their face. It's actually the experience of absorption that people who have serious gambling addictions are seeking. More casual gamblers may be gambling hoping to win, but for people who get addicted to these machines, as I say, it's the experience of doing it that is the thing that they seek. So you'll not see much by way of of affect by way of responsiveness on their part. They're just completely absorbed in what they're doing. But what you might notice is an uncanny similarity between the thing that they're doing with their hand and the thing that people do with their thumbs when they're looking at a social media app on their phone, the sort of the infinite scroll that you'll see in social media applications like Twitter, Instagram, and similar, just as a physical movement, has rhythms very similar to somebody gambling. And now, to go back a little bit to the basic psychology here, in the early 20th century, there was a very influential psychologist called B.F. Skinner. I expect some of you have heard of him, who innovated in a number of ways. One, his view of psychology was very much focused on inputs and outputs. We're not trying to get at the deep experiences in somebody's mind. We treat that as sort of beyond the reach of psychological science. But what we can study with great care is how different kinds of input and stimulus yield different kinds of behaviors. And so this became known as the Behaviorist School. These days, most people don't go as far as Skinner and treating people as kind of internally mysterious. But nonetheless, there are discoveries that he made that retain their validity. Some of his more notoriously famous experiments involve putting animals, usually rats or pigeons, in boxes where they would be given some simple task and the rewards for doing that task. So one version of this had a cage where there was a light, and when the light lit up, the animal had a lever in front of it, and if it pressed that lever after the light, a food pellet would come out. And these animals were kept hungry, so they really kind of craved the pellets. And as you can imagine, this led them to press the lever. But what they then did was they experimented with variations. And they found that a rat or a pigeon or another animal will keep pressing that lever when there's some stimulus, more often if it sometimes gives a food pellet than if it always gives a food pellet. It's a more compelling, more addictive, we might say, experience to have a chance of rewards than a guaranteed reward. Because you never know what's going to happen the next time you press the lever. And you can do further research and find, okay, what's the proportion of rewards? If pressing the lever will give a pellet 20% of the time, does that lead to more compulsion than 30% of the time, and so on and so on? And these original experiments were done, as I say, with simple animals, with rats and some kinds of bird. But the psychology of human addiction works quite similarly. People want to play one last hand, have one last round, precisely because of the uncertainty. Maybe this time it will win. But if they knew, it wouldn't generate the compelling experience in the way that it does. So, as I say, I'm talking here initially about gambling machines. But if you think now about your email client, they often have a little notification that goes up when a new email's arrived. But you don't know what that email is, you just know that there's a new one. And so it's a bit of a gamble. You know, is this going to be something interesting or important, or is it going to be more spam or things I don't really need to pay attention to? And again, it's the uncertainty that makes it feel particularly compelling to check. If your phone rings, most people's default settings make it say the same sound. With modern phones, you can program them to not do that, but most people don't. And so some of it's like the fun of finding out, oh, I wonder who this is. So one thing to notice is the way in which sort of the simultaneous grabbing of your attention, but the uncertainty of what's being offered is what makes the attempt to get our attention all the more effective. So if we were to try to sort of abstract what are the features here, One is an experience of solitude. In a casino, people may be packed together, but on those machines, they might as well be in an empty room. The fact there are other people physically present is clearly not part of their experience. The feedback is very rapid. You don't have to wait to see. It's not like sort of sending something off and getting something back in the mail. Moments after pressing the button, you see whether you've won or lost. And as I've already said, the randomness and uncertainty of the rewards helps to make it a more compelling experience. And finally, you have this kind of continuous experience where there's no natural endpoint. And that's a big part of what makes this so sinister. There are some contexts in which we might use metaphors of compulsion or even addiction in ways that are meant as a compliment and not a warning. So we might describe a particularly good novel in this kind of language. I couldn't put it down. It was compelling. It was a page turner. I didn't want to stop. But with a work of fiction, that's not as sinister because there is a natural stopping point, which is the end of the book. This is an experience that has a kind of built-in resolution, not one that threatens to sort of keep you going forever and ever. But as I say, in the realm of social media, people talk about the infinite scroll. You can just keep on tapping forever. There's no end to this. There's no off-ramp, nor is there any natural point of friction to say, well, maybe I should stop now. People have from time to time advocated for requiring manufacturers of various kinds of games and apps to do that, to have a little notification saying, hey, you've been doing this for 30 minutes. Have you considered taking a break and doing something else? To the best of my knowledge, while a few people have tried that, they haven't been terribly successful. And it's hard to overcome the compulsiveness of the experience when it's been engineered this well, or the economic incentives of the manufacturers of the apps and games and other digital experiences. I said before that one of the reasons this analogy I think is quite illuminating is compared to other kinds of gambling games, with these machines, it's the time you spend with them that correlates to the profit of the casino that put them there in the first place. It's worth thinking back to the early history of the internet. I mean, the internet sort of, where the history starts depends a little bit on what you decide to call the internet. So it's sort of, on one version of the story, it goes back a long, long way. In another version, it's more recent. But if you think about the emergence of the internet as something that people start to make money from, this is happening in the 90s and rapidly accelerating in the early 2000s. There are sort of ebbs and flows of this, but once it becomes clear this is a potential source of profits, there is a great deal of energy put into trying to figure out how to do that. And in the early stages of that period, it was hard to make payments over the internet. In the United States, it was actually illegal to send somebody money over the internet in the 1990s. I forget the exact year that changed, but early on in the commercial history of the internet, you couldn't give somebody credit card details. You had to contact them and then send them a check by mail, and they would send you the thing. The other key thing to keep in mind is people had the correct intuition that there would be enormous economic benefit to being first at something. So growing very rapidly was a very sensible strategic play. So growth was important. And that meant there were strong incentives to make the thing you were offering free. Just people would just sign up far more rapidly. In fact, PayPal, which became one of the dominant payment systems on the internet, actually paid people to sign up. I forget what the amount was in general, but in America, you could create an account and not do anything with it, and they would give you $10. And if you persuaded someone else to sign up, they would give that person $10 and they would give you $10. And they just decided it's actually easier to grow by simply giving people money to start with than by paying for advertising in order to get them to do it. So that gives you some sense of kind of what the economics of this was in this kind of early period of commercialization. But once people are used to getting something for free, they're very reluctant to pay for it. And it's hard to compete with people who are giving it away for free. But if they're giving something away for free, but trying to make a profit, they have to have revenue from another source. And the natural thing to do was advertising. And that became the dominant business model for so much of what happens on the internet. Some people have paid services, but it's harder to do it that way. The default always feels like something should be available for free. And the advertisers were quite excited because they're able to get data of a kind that wasn't there before. So if you think about the advertising on television or in a newspaper or something like that, they might have some broad knowledge of who's reading this newspaper, who's watching this program, but it's very broad. And they have to have the same advertisement for every version of this. You know, it's only with the new technology that you can tailor to an audience, which makes the advertising more valuable. So it's easy to understand why things developed in the way that they did, but having started that way, that's anchored our experience. And one way this is sometimes put, a phrase you may have encountered is, if you're not paying for something, you're not the customer, you're the product. You know, Facebook is selling advertisers your attention, and they're really good at it. Because the ability to gather data. One final thing before we leave this gambling analogy aside is it's important to realize that although the companies that were making these machines, the casinos that were making a profit from them, had enormous incentive to maximize that profit, the way they did it wasn't by hiring specialists in psychology with a really deep understanding of human choice and the psychology of addiction. They just did a bunch of A/B testing. Let's try it this way, let's try it the other way, and see what keeps people gambling for longer. And that by itself can be enormously powerful, even if you don't understand the underlying psychology. You just run the test again and again and again. Now, with physical machines, each time you rebuild the machine, that's quite an expensive and time-consuming process. But with code, it's much easier to try iteration after iteration after iteration. A/B testing can be done much more quickly. You can divide people into a variety of different groups, experiment with different designs, and then update in light of the information, orders of magnitude faster than you can do it with gambling machines. And so while there's been a kind of parallel history of the evolution of modern app design and these gambling machines, in the case of the gambling machines, we're talking about something which took 50 years. In the case of things like Facebook and Instagram and various other popular apps and games, you can almost see it happening before your eyes. That's how so fast the change is. And I think we should be very worried about this because, as I say, there are people who have come to regret their part in designing these things. And I think in some cases, there's a sense in which they didn't really understand what they were doing. They thought their job was in the next 3 months to have people spend more time on Facebook by 30%. And they were so invested in the short-term goals they were given that they didn't step back and think, hang on a second. If our goal here is to keep on trying to make people spend more time here, doesn't that amount to saying we're trying to make it more addictive as an experience? And the problem is, while there are people who have been talking about how you might design things in a way that was more humane, that better serve the interests of users, it's going to be hard to overcome the economic model here. Lots of these companies are publicly traded companies accountable to shareholders. And they simply can't turn around and say, well, we'd make more money this way, but we think it'd be better for our users if we were to sort of cut back on some of these design features. So one of the reasons I've called this a survivor's guide to the attention economy is I think for the foreseeable future, we have to recognize that's not going to change. The economic interests of many of these actors simply don't align with ours. And we're going to have to find ways to deal with that. We can certainly complain about what they're doing, but we can't change the fundamental sort of economic situation they find themselves in and the incentives that they're subject to. Okay. So a final quote from this. This is a contemporary journalist called Alexis Madrigal, who makes this explicit. What Facebook and slot machines share is the ability to provide fast feedback to simple actions. They deliver tiny rewards on an imperfectly predictable payout schedule. And again, that's a payout schedule just means the pattern of rewards that you get. And again, what makes it most compelling, most hard to step away from the table, step away from the machine, put down the phone, is when you can see that there's a pattern, but you can't predict the next item in that pattern. It's not purely random. If it was purely random, that would be less interesting. But there's a sort of pattern that keeps feeling constantly there, but not quite in reach. And as Madrigal says, these are coercive loops. So to turn this into advice, given that we can expect to continue to exist in an environment which is looking to grab our attention for reasons that don't serve our interests, be on the lookout for what are effectively Skinner boxes. When are we being conditioned? When do we see loopy design, a kind of Moorishness that has no natural endpoint? With our email clients and things like this, it's good to reduce notifications unless you really need them. Some people have lives where they do need to be constantly keeping an eye on their email box. But many of us do work which isn't really like that. I could probably get by checking my email twice a day. I check it much more than that, and I'm sort of trying to renegotiate my relationship with email. It's also helpful to customize your notifications. Often there are ways of setting things up so you can immediately see whether this is a call from somebody important or a message from somebody that you need to attend to, or something that can probably wait till later. It can take a little bit of time to set up, but again, making it not feel like a bit of a gamble is helpful for being able to process the information and not be distracted by it. Increase friction with devices. So just making it a bit harder to look at your phone, putting it in a drawer when you're at work, or having some code you have to enter or something like that. Just make it so it's not simply the touch of a single button to check your email. As I say, the machines became more addictive by making it easier and easier to go from one bit to the next. You no longer have to pull a lever, just a single tap of the button. So sometimes making things harder for us will actually serve our interests because we don't want it to be too easy to do certain things, which we spend too much time doing. If you can bring yourself to do it, you can get applications that make it easy to track your time. So basically you keep a diary of what you did in the given day, just what each block of time was being used for. And that can be a pretty unpleasant experience. Often if you do this for a week, you'll discover, wow, there's a lot of time here that feels kind of wasted. Not unaccounted for. I know what I did with that time, but wow, I spend more time doing this than I realized. It's quite easy to lose contact with what proportion of time you're actually giving to tasks, especially if you start going to be a bit more nuanced than just, was I working? Was I with my family? Was I watching a show? Sort of, if you say, no, not just in general, but kind of minute to minute, what did I allocate my time to in a given day? It can be a pain to do this. It's quite a sort of uncomfortable thing to do. But it can be a very useful self-assessment. And finally, try to avoid multitasking, or at least be very careful about what things you try to do together. I would sometimes say to my students, who would sometimes like try to write a paper while they'd have a sports game on the TV in the background, you're not really writing a paper. You're kidding yourself if you think you're doing valuable work here, but also you're ruining your enjoyment of the game. These are just not two things which are compatible. Now, there are some things you can do together without it being a problem. When I'm cleaning the house, I will sometimes listen to a podcast or something like that. And with very simple tasks, it's not necessarily a problem to try and do something else. But we badly overestimate our ability to do more than the one thing at a time. And also, we underestimate how long it takes you to get back into a position of complete absorption with a single task after you've been distracted. So after you've checked your email and you go back to the paper you're writing or some other task you're working on, you just won't be working at full capacity for a while, because it just takes your brain some time to readjust to being focused on the task at hand. And for some of the tasks we do, you need that focus to do it well at all. And there are other tasks where you might not strictly need the focus, but you'll get a more satisfying experience from giving it your whole focus. So you still want to be absorbed by this thing that you're doing. And so don't underestimate the cost of small distractions. Okay. I'm going to try and go quite quickly through the next parts, because I do want to make sure there's a good amount of time for questions. So one thing I'd like to sort of invite you to think about, but I'm not going to say much about today, is our relationship to the news. I'm a bit aware that my immediate experience of working with the news has been in England and then later in America. I have just less knowledge about like the culture of news consumption in Turkey. But nonetheless, I think some of what I'm going to say should apply. There's this quote I quite like by Ben Hecht saying, trying to determine what is going on in the world by reading newspapers is like trying to tell the time by watching the second hand of a clock. In America, there's a lot of discussion and concern about political bias in the news. There's a lot of complaints that different newspapers, different television networks have particular political lines that they push that affect the way they tell the news. And I think that complaint is valid. I think it'd be hard to deny. I think some cases are worse than others, but it's clearly the case that large news organizations will have biases of that kind. And I think that is a problem. However, I'd like to offer you the argument that that's not by any means the biggest problem with the news. There are even deeper problems than that. One is just the bias towards the new itself. The news likes to focus on fast-moving, rapid change. What just happened? There's a bias towards the sensational. What looks dramatic? What grabs your attention? And these things are built into the idea of giving people regular updates about what's just happened. So one thought experiment, and this isn't original to me, but sometimes used for this, is let's say you find yourself making a journey, or maybe on a train or something where you don't have to drive, you've got some time, and you see a newspaper. Oh, good, here's something I can read, and you pick it up and you find out it's from last week. And probably that newspaper becomes less interesting if it's a week old rather than from yesterday. And you have to ask yourself, well, what would have been so important to read last week that's now no longer worth my attention? It would be one thing if this was information that you used in your daily lives. And perhaps sometimes it will be. But a lot of what we do with the news is just talk about it. It doesn't actually affect the choices we're making on a day-to-day basis. If it does affect choices we make on a day-to-day basis, it's probably not coming from a newspaper designed for a general audience. So there are people in particular industries where they definitely need very up-to-date information. But those are needs for which other kinds of source information have developed. Again, there's a demand, and so people sort of step forward to meet that demand. So the kind of news I'm talking about is the news which is addressed just to a general audience. You know, people who live in this particular country or place, but with no more specification from that. And I would put it to you that just it's inherently difficult to usefully give information for such a general audience. And the final thing is, it focuses on things which change rapidly rather than things which are most important. There are lots of things which are important, but there's no particular moment in time where you cross a significant threshold. People who work in the news sometimes like to talk about the news as the first draft of history. You know, other people will come and tell the story again, but this is our first approximation. I think that greatly overestimates your ability to recognize which things are really important when seen from a distance. And if you go through an archive of a newspaper, just pick any random year and just spend some time seeing the front page. What was the headline? Only very occasionally will you see the front page news of the day is the kind of thing which would make a history book, even quite a detailed one. So I'm not necessarily trying to tell you, don't read the news. I am inviting you to ask in a quite concrete way what you actually do with the news, what sources seem helpful to you, and what your hopes for it are. Because otherwise the news has got very good at sort of grabbing our attention and getting us to be sort of agitated without being a reliable guide to the things that we most need to know. Again, sometimes it will track something which is genuinely important, but the economics of it are they have to print the same amount of words every day, regardless of what happened the day before. And when that's just the basic model of it, it will never be able to reliably track things that are worthy of your attention. I'm happy to sort of talk about that and see how it compares with your experiences, but I'll just add a few more things, then we can get to the Q&A. Okay, two last thoughts. This comes from a writer called Matthew Crawford, who wrote a book called The World Beyond Your Head, which is about attention, about the value of being absorbed in tasks which are worthy of our attention, and about the problems that come from being in a world where it's harder and harder to stay focused. So it's quite a long quote, but I think he's getting at something important. There are some resources that we hold in common, such as the air we breathe and the water we drink. We take them for granted, but their widespread availability makes everything else we do possible. I think the absence of noise is a resource of just this sort. More precisely, the valuable thing that we take for granted is the condition of not being addressed. Just as clean air makes respiration possible, silence in this broader sense is what makes it possible to think. So I've given you a picture here of Times Square in New York City, which is notorious for having just enormous amounts of people gathering together, these huge billboards reaching to the sky with flashing, shining advertisements. This is, of course, not a normal human experience. It's not a normal human experience in America or anywhere. It is an extreme case. But I offer it to you as an extreme version of a trend that we see increasingly in modern life. As you navigate public spaces, there are more and more things grabbing your attention. As you work with just day-to-day technologies, the tools of more and more of our day-to-day lives, they make demands of our attention that aren't being designed to serve our interest. And we need to find a language for talking about the cost that's being imposed. Things that make it harder to focus on our work, on our thoughts, on each other, we might say are a kind of pollution. They are making a common environment less suitable for the purposes of human life. It's hard to know where relevant lines should be drawn. But I think at least having some way of identifying and articulating the costs being imposed is going to be the starting point of any worthwhile conversation about what can be done about this. And then finally, a nice quote from the poet W.H. Auden: choice of attention, to pay attention to this and ignore that, is to the inner life what choice of action is to the outer. In both cases, a man is responsible for his choice and must accept the consequences, whatever they may be. And ultimately, I give this to you as a quote, which I think is right and gets at something important. But to say it's a choice is not to deny it's a choice that's made under constraints and under pressure. And most of what I've tried to talk about today has been about the pressures under which we make this choice, these choices, and why it's all the more important about how we firstly notice the patterns of our own choices and then think about ways we might want them to change.